Hello and welcome to this episode of Live with Lizzie Lee. I am your host, Lizzie. Joining me today is Ambassador Kaushik. Ambassador Kaushik, you've been called Singapore's undiplomatic diplomat. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the nickname.
Well, I think it's based on a false assumption of diplomacy. Diplomacy is not about being, always pleasant, agreeable, tactful. It is about advancing your country's national interests, preferably by being pleasant, agreeable, and tactful, but if necessary, by whatever means are appropriate. And I've always found in my career, I'm retired, by the way, you know that, right?
Yeah.
I've always found in my career, it is better to speak clearly rather than risk misunderstanding by trying to be too circumspect in how you express yourself. You don't have to be rude to people, but you should be clear, because diplomacy is ultimately about communication.
I wanted to start with US-China relations. Many have characterized the pair as strategic rivals. Some even predict Cold War 2.0 in the decades to come. I wonder how you would characterize US-China bilateral relation.
Okay, well, look, I think competition between major powers is inherent in international relations. And that reality was masked for a short and historically abnormal period after the end of the Cold War, because the overwhelming dominance of the US masked that reality. From 1972, when the US and China reassumed contacts, right? There were periods of tension, there was rivalry, there were disagreements over Taiwan, over human rights issues. Tiananmen happened. But by and large, the overall trajectory, despite these periods of tension and competition, was on engagement. Now it has flipped. I don't think engagement will completely be abandoned by either side, right? But certainly it's clear that the overall emphasis is on competition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is going to be a long-term structural feature of international relations. But for that reason, because it is a long-term structural feature, we should understand it correctly, accurately.
Right.
I really dislike this trope of
Mm-hmm.
a new Cold War to describe US-China competition. There are some superficial similarities between the earlier period of US-Soviet Union competition, but they are superficial.
Mm-hmm.
Look, the US and the Soviet Union led two different systems that were connected only at the margins. The US and China are both vital components of a single global system, connected to each other and to the rest of us, Singapore, Japan, you name it, right? Connected to each other and the rest of us by a new phenomenon that we have not seen in history before. And that new phenomenon is supply chains of a complexity, of a density, of a scope that have never before been seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those supply chains are what distinguish 21st century interdependence from earlier periods of interdependence. Now, I don't believe that this single system, this web in which all of us are enmeshed, is going to separate completely into two separate systems,
Mm-hmm.
as existed between the US and the Soviet Union in an earlier period. There has been already partial separation. The internet is very largely separated. There will be more separations in areas of technology that have national security implications. How the US and China deal with big data is already separating. There are two different means of dealing with it. And there are other examples, but I don't think you can completely separate it into two systems.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that unlike the US and Soviet Union, whose competition was between systems, the US and China are competing within a single system and will continue to do so. Neither of them particularly is comfortable with this. The West or the US talks about decoupling or at least reducing reliance on China in their supply chains, right? China talks about becoming more self-reliant in technology and relying more on domestic consumption to drive growth. And both of them will try to do this, but it's all easier said than done.
Mhm.
And even if it can be done, it will take a very long time.
Mhm.
And I don't think it can be done
Mhm.
totally.
Mhm.
Now, competition within a system is fundamentally different from competition between systems. For one thing, it is unlikely to end in a clear denouement as US-Soviet competition did.
Right.
Because I think while the US and China may want to dominate the single system, they don't really want to destroy the other because they can't without
Right.
hurting themselves,
Right.
right?
Right.
So it is a much more complex form of competition that is not going to end in any clear-cut outcome, right?
Mhm.
Secondly, it's not a binary competition. And I think I can give you a very good example, which is a contemporary example, is semiconductors.
Mhm.
I think we all know that semiconductors have emerged as a serious, at the high end, have emerged as a very serious vulnerability for China.
Right.
And I don't think it's going to be very easy for China to plug that vulnerability or catch up, because the semiconductor supply chain, which, by the way, is one of the most complicated ones in this world of complicated supply chains, all the very vital nodes are held by the US, its allies, or its friends, right? Whether you're talking about materials, whether you're talking about machine tools, whether you're talking about certain chemicals, and of course, the three main fabricators are Taiwan, South Korea, and the US itself.
Mhm.
On the other hand, China is 40% or more of the world semiconductor market. And you can't possibly cut off your own companies, those of your allies, those of your friends, from 40% of the market without doing them grievous damage.
Right.
So it's not a simple binary competition. And you see the latest regulations that the Biden administration has put into effect, right? Which are very serious in their effects. But almost immediately, they gave exemptions to a Taiwanese company, TSMC, and a South Korean company, because they need, who are producing in China, because they are not producing in China only for China.
Right.
They're producing for outside too. So I think it's going to be, China is in trouble as far as the high-end semiconductors is concerned, but the US cannot possibly cut it off completely. You're going to have to be more discriminating in what you sell to China and what you do to China, but you can't separate yourself. And that is a fundamental difference from the old Cold War.
Right.
So
Right.
I think it's a much more complicated kind of competition.
I see. I see. Fantastic. And I wanted to turn to Russia a little bit. As you know, the Ukrainian war has put Xi Jinping's relationship with Putin in the limelight. Do you think the partnership China has with Russia will be Xi Jinping or China's long-term liability?
I think it's an albatross around China's neck that has been put there by Mr. Xi Jinping and nobody else, right? When I read that 4th February statement talking about no limits to the partnership and no forbidden areas, I thought this is utter rubbish, that no professional diplomat would have agreed to this language. Now, I've worked with Wang Yi, and I've worked with Sergei Lavrov. He was my counterpart in the UN when I was ambassador to the UN. And Wang Yi was my counterpart when he was the ASEAN SOM leader for ASEAN, right? And whatever you may think of the policies that they serve, they are very good professional diplomats. And I can't believe that either of them would have thought that it is a good idea to have this kind of language in a joint statement. It must be these two geniuses that they serve cooking it up among themselves. And you see the result. China is in a terribly awkward position. China is neuralgic about sovereignty, about non-interference, and so on, for obvious reasons. Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet. And what is Russia doing in Ukraine? And China can't even call it a war, right? China is facing all kinds of complicated economic problems. There's going to be a future of slower growth, right? I think we all know that. And the last thing they need is this extra trouble. They are quite very cautious about getting entangled in secondary sanctions. And they can't be very, Putin can't be very happy with the kind of support he's getting from Xi Jinping, which is a lot of verbal support, diplomatic support, but not, as far as anybody can see, any material support that he needs, right? China, on the other hand, it gets some cheap energy from Russia and some minerals and so on. And that's all to the good, right? But if I was China, I wouldn't want to get too dependent on any single source for my energy needs either. And they're not. They are still continue to diversify. And so it's just trouble for both sides. On the other hand, I don't think they're going to break. They can't. Why? A very simple reason. China has no other partner anywhere in the world of equal strategic weight to Russia that shares its distrust of the West. And ditto for Russia. Russia has no other partner anywhere in the world of any strategic weight that shares its distrust of the West. So, like it or not, you saw how they looked at each other in Uzbekistan. Right? They were not happy campers, but they're stuck with each other.
Right. I see. Fantastic. I wanted to turn to Southeast Asia a little bit, a region you are very familiar with. The United States has reduced its footprint in Southeast Asia, and China is stepping up its economic engagement in the region. So how should Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore, navigate US-China competition?
Well, first of all, I don't think America has reduced its footprint in Southeast Asia, right? Except relatively, because China has increased its footprint. That's not an absolute reduction, it's a relative reduction. If you look at the figures, I mean, I haven't checked them for some time, but I'm sure they're still valid. The stock of American investment in Southeast Asia is greater than that of China, Japan, South Korea combined, right? And I think it will remain so, right? China may have an edge in investment in infrastructure, because that is notoriously difficult to make money from, and and in some other areas. But overall, the US is still, it's not our biggest trading partner anymore, but it's still a very important trading partner bilaterally. So I don't think the US has reduced its footprint. The 7th Fleet has been a constant presence in Southeast Asia for more than 50 years. Right? Sometimes it's at a higher tempo, sometimes it's at a lower tempo, but it's always been there. Now, China, by virtue of its size, by virtue of its contiguity to Southeast Asia, it shares common borders, and virtue of its economic weight, is always going to have significant influence in Southeast Asia. But for precisely those same reasons, its size, its economic weight, its contiguity, China is always going to arouse anxieties in Southeast Asia. Which has done very little to assuage and quite a lot to enhance by its behavior in the South China Sea and in the upper reaches of the Mekong and so on. Now, there is therefore, I think, a much better appreciation in Southeast Asia of the vital role that America plays in balancing off China so that we can enjoy a close relationship with China without compromising autonomy or sovereignty. These are not alternative. One is a necessary condition of the other. I'll give you an example. I mean, Singapore has never been shy about saying what I just said since the 1960s, that America is a vital component of any balance in not just Southeast Asia and East Asia. No America, no balance, right? Okay. And it was always thought by other Southeast Asian countries, other members of ASEAN, as something of a rather eccentric Singaporean attitude. Now, in the late 1980s, 88, 89, a combination of natural disaster and Filipino domestic politics, and if you're unkind, you will say Filipino domestic politics is a natural disaster, forced the US out of Subic Bay and Clark Airfield, right? And we in Singapore thought we should put our money where our mouth is and offer the US the use of our facilities, because it was important. They in no way can Singapore make up for Subic Bay and Clark Airfield. I don't know if you've ever been to those places. Okay, you can take up Singapore and drop it into Subic Bay or Clark Airfield and we'll never be found again. So we can't make up for that, right? But we thought politically and symbolically it is important to have some physical American military presence in Southeast Asia. So we offered our facilities to the US. And in 1990, we signed an MOU with the US to give effect to that. Now, all hell broke loose. Our neighbors reacted hysterically, as if we had conspired with the devil, that's the US, to kidnap their firstborn children and sell them into slavery, right? It was particularly Indonesia and Malaysia. That's 1990, hysterical reaction. Fast forward to 2019, when we renewed that MOU. With full publicity. My Prime Minister signed it with Donald Trump in the UN in New York. And you can't do anything discreetly with Donald Trump, right? What happened? Nothing happened. Nobody reacted. None of our neighbors even uttered a whisper.
Mhm.
And in between, in 2005, we signed a strategic partnership agreement, a defense partnership agreement. We are not a US ally, by the way, and we don't want to be one.
Mhm.
But we signed in 2005 this partnership agreement that brought our security and defense cooperation with the US just below the level of what the US does with former treaty allies like Japan or Australia, and certainly much higher than what the US does with its former treaty allies in Southeast Asia, which is the Philippines and Taiwan. What happened again? Nothing happened. Why? Well, I think there is a better understanding that what Singaporeans have been saying all the time. The US is a vital element of balance. It's not just a eccentric Singaporean attitude, but a strategic reality. Now, for a variety of reasons, maybe domestic reasons, the US, I mean, some Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, for domestic reasons, I think, may not be able to do what we do with the US. But they do what they can. And I think there's a better realization what Singapore does with the US is a regional common good. So I think the US is not lowering its footprint. In fact, it's better appreciated in Southeast Asia. And having a good relationship with both is a necessary condition of navigating great power rivalry. This is not a new thing to Southeast Asia. We are a strategic crossroads. For centuries, we have been at this intersection of great power rivalry. And, there are certain instincts that have been ingrained in Southeast Asian countries. I don't say that we always do it well, right? But it is our instinct. I have never forgotten what my Vietnamese counterpart told me years ago. I asked him, this must have been more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe, when I was still in service as a foreign service officer. I asked him what a change of leadership in Hanoi meant for Vietnam's relations with China. And Vietnam has a terribly complicated relation with China. And he said, look, Bilahari, every Vietnamese leader has to be able to stand up to China. Every Vietnamese leader must be able to get along with China. And if you think you can't stand up and get along simultaneously, you don't deserve to be the leader. And that is generally a Southeast Asian attitude in different ways, right? And, that is premised on having a balance of power in the region. By the way, I don't think China is doing very well. The last 10 years have been quite disastrous for Chinese diplomacy around the world, including in Southeast Asia. We are much more polite, so we don't shout at each other too much, but there are great apprehensions. The Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore has done annual surveys of elite attitudes among all 10 ASEAN countries. And it's been very consistent. You ask some version of the question, is China important? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. You ask some version of the question, do you trust China? The answer is overwhelmingly no. Right. And that's generally, I think, a global attitude.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And this is all down to this genius who went into a no limits partnership, Mr. Xi. He's one of the worst foreign policy emperors that China has ever had.
Right. So as a career diplomat, what's your advice to your Chinese counterparts, the so-called wolf warrior diplomats?
Look, I feel very sorry for them, I've met many very excellent Chinese diplomats. Forget about whether you agree with their policy or not, right? Professional, their professional is good. Wang Yi is one of them. But he's been acting like an idiot lately because he's not allowed to be good. And these wolf warriors, as I said at the very beginning of our conversation, diplomacy is not all about being nice.
Right.
But if you're not going to be nice, you have to have some purpose in it. Some purpose of advancing your country's national interests, right? I don't see how this wolf warrior diplomacy advances China's national interests at all. And I don't think they are acting to advance China's national interests. They are acting to cover their own rears. They are talking to Beijing, not to their host governments. And I feel rather sorry for them.
Right.
So my advice to them is, try to do the minimum damage you can.
I see. So Xi Jinping is all but certain to secure another third 5-year term.
Yeah.
What should we expect in terms of Xi Jinping's policy?
I don't think we should expect any significant change, and it was very clear in his speech on Sunday, right? There's nothing new in his speech, and he not a single hint of changing course in any significant way in any of the major policy areas. So I think we're going to expect more of the same. And as China's growth slows down, he's going to rely more and more on this ethno-nationalist narrative of humiliation, rejuvenation, and realizing the China dream, which I think is the cause of some of the bad behavior that has caused concerns around the world. Mm-hmm. Look, if you say that I am humiliated, I was humiliated, and therefore you all owe me, that's a very entitled attitude, and it causes you to behave in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Right? It also makes it very difficult for you to come to diplomatic compromises, because this was mine, you stole it from me, so I want it back. So how do you have a diplomatic compromise? Right? So I don't think it's in China's interest. And I have told my Chinese counterparts when I was in service, look, you are a great power. Great powers have big ambitions, nothing unusual with that. Mm-hmm. But your narrative is a very ethnocentric narrative. It is not one that can appeal outside the Sinosphere. Mm-hmm. And even for overseas Chinese, they will not, all of them, share Xi Jinping's claim that all Chinese, by which he means, I think, Zhonghua Minzu, should share the China dream. You ask the Taiwanese, they won't say they share that dream. They have their own dreams. You ask a Singaporean Chinese, they won't share the total China dream. So I think it's a very self-limiting narrative, but it's the only one they have. Who believes in class struggle in China anymore? Maybe Mr. Xi, nobody else, I think.
If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.